Hello and welcome. Today we're diving deep into the mind of Carl Jung, and specifically his powerful critique of psychology itself. He argued that to really get a handle on the human psyche, the field had to look way deeper, past its own biases and into the symbolic language of the soul. And he started with a pretty stark warning.
Jung kicks things off with this incredibly potent statement. He looked at the supposedly objective science of psychology and saw something else. A collection of personal biases. This one insight, that the psychologist is always part of the equation, is what drove his entire life's quest for a more humble, more integrated, and frankly, a more effective way to understand the mind.
All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with Jung's big critique of the field. Then we'll get into why the mind's illnesses are so complex. From there, we'll see how he turned to the ancient art of alchemy for a symbolic guide, zeroing in on this idea of uniting opposites. And finally, we'll wrap up with his vision for a truly whole global psychology. So let's jump right in with Jung's diagnosis of his own profession. He looked at the state of psychotherapy back in the early 20th century, and, well, he saw a huge problem.
He didn't see a collaboration, he saw a battleground. You had the Freudians over here, the Adlerians over there, and a bunch of others, and each one was stuck inside its own closed system, totally convinced they had the one and only answer. Jung just called it what it was: chaos.
And Jung was incredibly specific with his criticisms. He called out this theoretical narrow-mindedness, where every school thought its one theory could explain, well, everything. He said it got so bad it bordered on sectarian bigotry, which is some pretty strong language. For Jung, the real failure was a total lack of self-criticism. That's what let each school mistake its own tiny slice of the pie for the whole truth.
Jung's whole point was that a real science of the psyche couldn't be the work of one single genius or one school of thought. No way. It had to come from bringing together all these contradictory views, from people working together to build a much, much bigger picture of what it means to be human.
And this critique wasn't just about the therapists, it was about the very nature of what they were trying to treat. Jung argued that the field was working with a massively oversimplified idea of mental illness. Jung's analogy here is just brilliant, and it's so simple, right? We would never expect one single pill to cure every physical problem, from a common cold to a broken leg. So why, he asked, would we ever expect one theory to fix every single ailment of the mind? The psyche, he insisted, is every bit as complex as the body.
And if you follow that logic, it becomes obvious that some psychological issues are mainly physical in origin, while others are almost purely psychological. So a therapist with only one theory, only one tool in their toolbox, they're going to fail a lot of their patients, simply because they can't see this crucial difference.
This is where Jung just completely flips the script. You see, where other people saw this huge variety of therapies and thought, see, nothing really works, he saw proof of the psyche's incredible complexity. Having a ton of different remedies isn't a weakness, it's a necessary response to all the different ways a person can suffer. Okay, and this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. If all the modern psychological theories were just too narrow, where could you find a language rich enough, deep enough, to describe the transformative processes of the soul? Well, Jung found his answer in a very, very unexpected place: the symbolic world of alchemy.
This was the central question for Jung. He knew the unconscious doesn't speak in neat, clinical terms. It speaks in symbols, in myths, in dreams. And he realized that the alchemists had, without even knowing it, created a kind of forgotten map to this deep inner world.
The whole alchemical journey starts with something called the prima materia. Now, for Jung, this wasn't some rare, exotic chemical. It was the raw, messy, undifferentiated stuff of our own minds. Our neuroses, our conflicts, the parts of ourselves we haven't lived out. It is, just as the alchemist said, found everywhere.
This old alchemical verse just perfectly nails the idea. The material for our greatest transformation, the legendary philosopher's stone, it isn't something glamorous or impressive. It's the uncomely stone, the part of ourselves that we look down on, that we ignore, the stuff we think is worthless. That, Jung believed, is where the real gold is hiding.
So the process works in three basic stages. First, you have dissolution. That's breaking down our rigid ego ideas back into that raw primary state. Second is imagination. And we're not talking about idle daydreaming. This is a focused, conscious inner work with that raw material. And finally, you get to the ultimate goal, the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. Now, this idea of the conjunctio, you could argue it's the absolute heart of Jung's entire psychological project. It's all about making ourselves whole by bringing together the warring factions that live inside each of us.
The alchemists used this incredibly rich, poetic language for this. You have the male, symbolized by the sun, representing the conscious, active, fiery parts of us. And then you have the female, the moon, representing the unconscious, receptive, watery parts. Think of it like logic and emotion, or spirit and body, consciousness and the unconscious.
So the conjunctio, then, is the symbolic reunion of these two halves, healing that fundamental split in our psyche. It's that moment when the conscious ego finally reconnects with its lost other half, the soul. And Jung was clear, this isn't about blending them into some boring gray mush. It's about holding them both together in a dynamic, creative tension. And the outcome of this union? It's not just a truce. It creates something totally new, a third thing. The alchemists called it the philosopher's stone, or the elixir of life. For Jung, this was the perfect symbol for the integrated personality, the whole redeemed self.
So how does all of this inner alchemical work connect back to the big picture? Well, for Jung, uniting opposites wasn't just a job for the individual. He believed the entire field of psychology needed to go through its own conjunctio, its own synthesis of opposites.
It's the exact same principle, just applied on a global scale. Just like you or I have to unite our inner opposites to become whole, Jung argued that psychology as a science has to unite opposing worldviews to even begin to understand humanity. And he was very specific about this. He saw the Western mind as brilliant in its outward-looking, rational, scientific approach. But he also saw it as dangerously one-sided. So he looked to the East, particularly to what he called the Indian mind, for its thousands of years of expertise in introspection and the inner world, to provide that essential balance.
So this is the vision he leaves us with. A truly objective psychology isn't the work of one person. It has to be a collaborative effort that embraces contradiction, that constantly questions its own biases, and that strives for something we desperately need, a common, basic understanding of what it means to be human.
And really, that's the question I want to leave you with. Jung was writing this almost a century ago, but his call to action feels more urgent today than ever. He challenged the psychologists of his time to face their prejudices. So, looking at our own fragmented world today, what subjective prejudices, in our culture and psychology, and even in our own lives, are we still mistaking for universal truth?